This is my first webinar, so welcome everybody to the webinar. This is Nature Neighbors. My name is Celeste and I work with Community Nature Connection, and Kathy is joining me from National Park Service. And I'm gonna ask everybody to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. If you want to just say your name and if you're affiliated with an organization and where you're joining us from, whether it's what city or what room in your house, please welcome. Hi, Vinay. We also have some folks that are part of our Zoom, that are members of our Zoom. So if you're joining under the Community Nature Connection Zoom account, you're gonna be a panelist. So you can answer some questions, or you could just stay muted. All right, looks like we have Kelly joining from Community Nature Connection at home in Sherman Oaks. Welcome, Kelly. And then we also have Kelly joining from Quebec. Amazing. Welcome, Kelly. Nice to see you back at another training. Yeah, I think our trainings in the past have been in the Zoom meeting format. So we've had more participation where we can have cameras and have like people chatting, but we're trying out the webinar today. So I can't see participants, but I can see how many there are. So I know a few of you are here. Thank you for being here. So for those just joining, if you could go ahead and type in the chat box a little introduction, go ahead and share your name, where you're joining us from, and if you're affiliated with an organization, you can share that too. And you can share the city or location you're joining us from, or which room in your house. Yeah, thank you. Hi, Millie. Thanks for joining us from Franklin Canyon. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. We're going to kick it off and get started in just a minute. And if you're just joining us again, go ahead and give us a little introduction in the chat box, your name and where you're joining us from. And in about one more minute, we're going to get started. So thank you all for being here. All right, so my name is Celeste and I am the Training Institute Manager with Community Nature Connection, and I'm excited to be here today for our Nature Neighbors webinar. So thank you everybody for joining us. Community Nature Connection, we are a nonprofit organization. Our mission is to increase access to the outdoors for diverse communities. And we do this in partnership with those communities through innovative programming. One of our programs is the Training Institute, and this is a session that is part of the Training Institute this morning. The Training Institute is our program, and our goal is to increase access to training opportunities that are related to the outdoor field and some professional development opportunities as well. So our trainings have transitioned to the online format since March, and we're gonna have that ongoing for now. So keep checking back on our website. We'll be adding new trainings as they are scheduled. And so thank you guys so much for being here. a little housekeeping Zoom etiquette. We're on a webinar this morning, and so we're going to be taking questions throughout the webinar. We'll be pausing in certain places during the presentation. So if you have questions, we encourage you to enter them into the Q&A box. And you'll see that in your Zoom controls. You should see Q&A at the bottom bar of your Zoom controls. And so go ahead and fire away questions. I'll be monitoring them while Kathy's presenting, and we'll get to them throughout the presentation. If we don't get to them, we'll have time at the end to answer questions as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kathy from National Park Service, and she is going to lead us in the Nature Neighbors webinar. So thanks, everybody.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Kathy Schoonmaker. I'm a biologist with the National Park Service for the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. I'm going to be talking about the wildlife and that's all around us, especially being here in Southern California, adjacent to LA, one of the largest populated cities around. So we do have wildlife in our open space. And biologists at the Park Service have been studying some of these animals, and we'll talk a little bit about them today. So hopefully you can all see the screen. I'm sure that many of these are very common to you. We have bobcats, fox, deer, raccoons, of course, in the urban areas, and coyotes, but we even have mountain lions, so we want to make sure we are aware that we have mountain lions in our hills. Uh-oh, let's see if I can, oh, there we go. So as I mentioned, I work in the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. This is basically your local national park. It's not Yosemite or Yellowstone, which means it has some of its own challenges because we don't own all of the property within the recreation area. It's just a boundary that's been written basically along to preserve these mountains and hillsides. And the Park Service actually only owns certain parts of it, and State Parks owns a lot as well, but we have a lot of private homeowners that live within the mountains and the boundary lines. Although it is a pretty awesome spot, it's a 1 out of 5 Mediterranean ecosystems, and we've got 1,600 different species that are found here in the mountains, so it's pretty cool. The challenges, though, of being so close to urbanization, and that's part of what we're going to talk about. So you can see here, this is a nice Google view where you can see that the mountains basically are here. Nice, beautiful open space, but we have a lot of challenges where we have urbanization over here, all this gray. We have the San Fernando Valley here. We do go up into the Simi Hills, but then you have the ocean on this side, which ends up being a barrier for any of these animals as well. And we'll talk about that as we go. So all of those animals live kind of on the urban edge, is you could say. And here's another example of some of the challenges these animals have is we're still developing in the Santa Monica Mountains. There's continuous development, and you can see you have a whole neighborhood right here on top of this hillside, but yet there's open space kind of in between and natural landscape. So these animals end up moving back and forth between these natural landscapes, but they have to cross the urbanization to do so. So how are we monitoring and tracking wildlife? First of all, we want to put cameras out there. As biologists, we put cameras out in the fragmented landscapes and the landscape just to see what wildlife is there. Wildlife cameras are pretty great because you don't have to be there to do the monitoring. You put the camera out, it's motion censored and heat censored. So when an animal walks past it, it takes a picture of them. So we'll use the cameras and we'll use tracks sometimes to, especially for target species that we're looking for, which might be mountain lions or coyotes or bobcats. But these are some of the cool pictures that we end up getting with those wildlife cameras. The striped skunk, and occasionally we get a spotted skunk. Not terribly common here, but they do look a little bit different. They have spots on their backs and then that bushy white at the ends of the tail. Raccoons, of course. And anytime in your yards, if you're predicting that maybe a raccoon is messing with the grass, it's always great to look for tracks of raccoons because they're very obvious and just kind of fun to see. There's opossums, of course, that can be found in, especially in the urban landscape. Raccoons and possums are both omnivores, so they're pretty common in that urban landscape, as well as coyotes. So they venture into the urban landscape fairly often because there's a lot of food resources available for them there. Gray foxes, though, you won't see too often in that urban landscape, but if you're lucky, you might see tracks of one in the natural space. And these are some great pictures of a gray fox, one carrying a squirrel here. And of course, we have coyotes. I want you to notice with the gray fox and the coyotes that you definitely see nail tracks or nails in the tracks, whereas you won't see that with bobcats, and we'll show you that in a minute. Mule deer. There are badgers in the Santa Monica Mountains. They prefer kind of that open grassland areas. You do not see them very often, though. Rarely do we see them just by being out there. So the remote camera is really nice to be able to see these shy, secretive animals that are nocturnal. Today we're going to be talking a lot about mountain lions and bobcats specifically. So making sure we know the difference between who is who. What are the differences between mountain lions and bobcats? Well, first of all, there's definitely a size difference. Mountain lions can get up to about, the females are about 90, males can get up to 130, 140 pounds, whereas the bobcats are closer to about 20. Some of them, the females are about 14 pounds, so much smaller. Also, it's important to note that even though young mountain lions have spots, they can often be confused by many people of a young bobcat. So a lot of times when we get calls out, I saw a young mountain lion, a lot of times the biologists say, well, you sure it wasn't a bobcat? Because they are very spotty, and it's more likely you're going to see a bobcat than you are going to see a baby mountain lion out there in the natural space. But if you are looking and you do happen to get to see a mountain lion, make sure you look for that tail to help you identify the difference. A mountain lion's tail is almost as long as its body, where a bobcat's tail is about 8 inches long. Very, very short. It's there, it flicks and moves back and forth, so it's very obvious, but it is much shorter than a mountain lion. And bobcats, if you're able to see it close up or through binoculars, you'll see that they have pointy points around their ears, whereas a mountain lion's ears are more on the rounded shape. Here's just an example of the tracks and how they're different. Mountain lions have much bigger tracks than a bobcat, so it's a great way to show the size difference. Another example of a bobcat, and see here, you can see the little tufts at the top of the ear that's got more of that pointed ear. Bobcats also have this little white spot in the back behind their ears if you see their ears in the back. As I was mentioning, no toenails in the tracks for bobcats or mountain lions, and that's because they have retractable claws just like our house cats do, whereas coyotes do not. Another great example of a bobcat and all those spots. And then here's our mountain lion. This is just an example of, this is my hand, and you can see the mountain lion paw is as big, maybe a little bit bigger than my hand. And again, that long tail. So that's just how we at first try to figure out what types of wildlife are out there in the park or in the natural areas. But we also wanted to learn more about these animals in general, and specifically how urbanization affects them, the local carnivores. So today, because we have only about an hour, hour and a half, we're just going to talk about bobcats and coyotes. The Park Service has been studying these animals since 2002 for mountain lions, and bobcats since 1996. So over 15 years of research on these animals. And we're looking at how they move through the urban environment, how often do they come into those urban environments, the diets of these animals, and some of the causes of mortality that might be seen with these animals in this landscape. So I just wanted to show another picture of the Santa Monica Mountains and where most of our study area is. You'll get to see this map a lot during the presentation. And so this, as I mentioned, is the Santa Monica Mountains. And the Santa Monica Mountains is kind of like a island. It's surrounded by freeways, and this is the 101, which is about a 10-lane freeway, the 405 freeway, and then you have the Oxnard Plains, which is very open landscape with agriculture. And then right here you have the ocean, and these guys don't swim that far, so they're not going to be crossing the ocean. So they're kind of stuck or landlocked into this area of the Santa Monica Mountains. We also do research though here in the Simi Hills. A lot of our bobcat research was right here in the Simi Hills to look at the smaller fragmented habitats. And then we also have been doing some work with the mountain lions up in the Santa Susanas as well. So habitat loss and habitat fragmentation in Southern California. These are just some examples of what these animals kind of have to live with, and the habitat that's available for them, and how urbanization is affecting them. So this is encroachment basically. So this is natural space here. You can see all the shrubs, but you can see development is right up along the boundaries of it. And in many cases, shrubs starts to go away, and then more houses come in. And don't forget, every time you build a house along this natural landscape, and the closer you get, then there's that how to deal with fire. And so there's a lot of fire clearance that ends up happening. And so now you have more habitat loss for these animals. Constantly having new development, as I mentioned in the beginning. And then this is an example of just how it gets fragmented. This is a habitat patch here, and then this is a small habitat patch here that we actually had a bobcat using. This bobcat had to go back and forth between these two habitats and would cross the neighborhoods every few weeks. And then this is just a nice example of alteration, how we're changing the landscape. It's not completely lost habitat, but it's different. And this is a dump site here. And another example of an alteration or a change of their habitat might be a golf course that's developed, or a city park that was made, or even just changing rivers into what used to be rivers that were covered and dirt are now cement. How do we study these animals? Well, we have to catch them. So this is a bobcat that we caught in a cage, and we do have to anesthetize them because they are cats. Cats are not terribly friendly. They do not want you to pet them. So we do anesthetize them. They're out for about an hour. And then during that time, we take every possible measurement we can take. We take measurements of their total body length, their neck sizes. We take blood so we can see what kind of diseases they've been exposed to. We measure their teeth so we can age them. And this is for bobcats, mountain lions, and coyotes that we do research on. And then we put a radio collar on these animals so that we can track their movement patterns. Over the years, technology has changed quite a bit, and we've been able to use GPS collars now, which make things a lot easier. And we used to go out and hand track everybody every single day, but now we can do a lot of it through satellite and the computers. So as I mentioned, what is habitat? Well, I think there's a misconception where most people think that wildlife only lives here in this natural landscape. But in reality, a lot of wildlife venture into these urban areas. No one ever wrote a memo, or there's no big flashing signs for these animals that say do not cross and do not enter into this area. This is people habitat, this is wildlife habitat. We're still getting those signs out. But so it's really important, especially if you live on an urban edge here, that you know the wildlife that live here in the natural area and understand that they easily will venture into these urban areas. And I think that's one of the big messages we really want to get out, and want to make sure that you guys get that out to others as well. And this is a nice example of that. So we have, these are some of our points from our radio collar locations. And you can see the animals coming right up to the urban edge here. They'll use these little fingers to come through, cross roads. And majority of their points tend to stay in these little natural landscape creek beds so they can get to the other side. But there are some animals that will cross right through the backyards. They'll jump the fences, things like that. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. Just want to show examples. So we take all of those points for the same animal, and we'll basically draw on all the outskirts of the points. We'll draw a polygon to determine what their home range is for each particular individual animal. And this is an example of a home range of a female bobcat in one of our fragmented habitats. One of the other things that we were looking at is how do male and female bobcat home range sizes different. And you can see in blue here, we have female home ranges, and in orange and red, we have male home ranges. And the male home ranges are larger than the females, you can see that. And then the males also, we found, tend to venture out into those urban landscapes and cross the roads a little more than the females do. And you're seeing that here. And that's part of their behavior and ecology. Males are always looking for females to breed with. They're also looking to protect their territory or their home range as well. So they'll mark and they'll scrape and try to protect that area from other males. So as you can see, these two males are overlapping a little bit to protect that home range. One of the other things we were able to look at is reproduction of these bobcats, and were they able to reproduce successfully in these fragmented habitats. And we did find that females were reproducing. We also found something that was interesting is females were actually even overlapping their home range territories, and partially because they might be really closely related. We were finding the ones that were overlapping were a little more related to each other, maybe daughters of the moms and then we also believe that because the home range is the fragment is so small, they really don't have a choice but to sort of overlap their home ranges. The stars here are actually where we found dens of these bobcats. And then I just want to show that this one you'll see, this is urbanization, this is a neighborhood here, and you can see female bobcat den right here in someone's backyard. So I want to show that it's not always, they don't always stay in that natural habitat. As I mentioned, they do venture out into these urban landscapes. And we'll show you that in a minute as well. Overall, these are some of the interesting places that we found the dens. We found in hollows of trees, which has been pretty neat. Sometimes they might just den in a really thick bush. But also we found many dens in wood rat nests. So they must go in and vacate that wood rat, and then they den right here in the nest. You can see this is pretty safe, or it seems like a nice, safe, secure place. And this is a picture of them in the wood rat nest, little kittens. And as I mentioned, the unusual den sites that we've seen. This is right in someone's backyard. They denned right here in the bushes. And then they also denned, and this is 2 years in a row, this female bobcat and her, it was either her sister or her mom, ended up denning with her or helping her raise these young. And it was right here is a wall that joins two backyards. And you can see there was a hole, so there was deferred maintenance in this wall. And she found this hole and determined it was a nice, safe place for her and her kittens. And here's mom right here looking at the homeowner taking the picture. Definitely unique spots. We also looked at the diet for bobcats. So this is, we would go around and walk trails and we picked up scat and then we wash it. And then what's great about it is after you wash it and you break it up and you get all that debris off, you get to look at all these interesting teeth. And the teeth tend to hold its form, and we're able to actually determine what species they were eating. Was it a mouse? Was it a rat? Squirrels? So all kinds of different things we were finding in there, and hair as well. And for bobcats, we found that majority of their diet was rabbits during the dry season and the wet season. We also found that pocket gophers were really important food source for them, as well as wood rats. So they're great at helping us control that rodent population along the urban landscape. And rabbits, which might be one of the reasons we see them in the urban landscapes on occasion, they tend to use the urban landscapes is because at nighttime, there's nobody really out, but there's a lot of rabbits out on our manicured lawns. So it's a great place for them to get food. Just another example of habitat fragmentation. This is one of our larger habitat fragments, but again, these animals, especially the males, end up crossing these roads to make sure they have other females to breed with. And you can see they have to pass through urbanization to do this throughout that area. But unfortunately, that can lead to mortality from roadkill. And that was one of the sources of mortality we were seeing. This is a road right here. And you can see these guys were crossing basically the road encompassed their home range. So they crossed fairly frequently. One of the other sources of mortality that we were seeing with bobcats is mange. And mange is a mite that gets into their skin. Mange is common in the environment. It's been seen, but these guys were getting it pretty severely. It gets into their skin, they lay eggs and they start eating the skin of the bobcats. And you can see their eyes start to crust over. And eventually these animals end up starving to death because they can't see anymore. And they're constantly scratching and they give themselves infections from this, this mite. What we did find is that animals that had mange also had pretty high levels of rat poisons. And so we believe that there is an interconnection where the rat poisons are actually weakening the immune system of these bobcats, and they're not able to fight the disease of mange, which if they didn't have as much rat poisons in their system, they might be able to do that. Just a quick view of what we found with our animals. That here's a fragmented habitat that was highly populated with bobcats. We had probably 7 bobcats in this area. And then after we had the outbreak of mange, we had very few, and they weren't using it as much as their home range. They would just kind of come back and forth periodically across this road, where majority of their points were over here that they were using for the home range. And then in 2009, we started to see bobcats coming back in to this area. And we're kind of at that level right now. We're still monitoring this area where we're not seeing as much right now, but we also had the big fires, which came through this habitat also. So there's been a lot of challenges for the bobcats over here in this fragmented landscape. So I guess this is probably a good time to stop and ask questions. If anyone had any?
There's nothing in the Q&A box, but if anybody has a question, we'd love to take questions now, and we'll be taking questions later too. We have a question. Sarah Jane asks, can mange be treated?
Mange can be treated, but sometimes by the time we can actually catch the animal, they're so far, they're so sick that it doesn't help. And even catching that animal after it has mange is really difficult because, like I mentioned, they get to the point where they can't see anymore. So when we catch an animal that has mange, we just happen to catch an animal that has mange, we'll try to treat it with ivermectin. And so, which is basically the same kind of stuff that you would give your pets, you know, to keep fleas and to treat mange for them. So it can be. The problem is actually catching it before, helping them before they actually get so bad. And that's just really, really difficult.
Thank you for the question.
Okay.
We have one more question that's come in. Are there speed limit signs in these neighborhoods?
That's funny you say that. You know, I think these neighborhoods have probably a 40-mile-per-hour, you know, sign. So there are speed limits. I think maybe you could put speed limits out all over the place. You could put wildlife crossing, which they do in some places. I think that anywhere that has, you know, that habitat that's right up next to a road, it'd be great to have road crossing, you know, bobcat crossing. But there's no actual official county signs that they put up for bobcat crossing in those areas. I've seen residential people or homeowners actually put signs up in their yards that say, you know, bobcat crossing or slow down, you know, that kind of stuff, which if you were to drive Canaan, I think there's someone put a sign off of their yard, which is pretty interesting. But yeah, no, yeah, it's just really hard. The best things are, you know, giving them areas that they can cross, you know, under or over these roads is kind of important. Or fencing that keeps them off the roads and directs them to cross where you want them to cross.
Thanks for your questions.
Yes. Okay, so we'll go ahead and talk about mountain lions now, which doesn't mean you can't ask those questions, you know, bobcat, if you have any more about bobcats or anything after. So mountain lions, as you can imagine, are especially vulnerable to urbanization and habitat fragmentation because their home range is actually so much bigger. The bobcats really only have a home range of about 2.5 to 5 square miles, whereas mountain lion home ranges are really large. And you can imagine they're just a bigger animal and they have a lot of places, they need a lot of space. This is just an example of some of the mountain lions we've studied. We're actually up to, I think, 78 now. So we have quite a few lions that we have studied over time. Now, remember, they're not all on the air at the same time. We've been doing this, this study since 2002. So, but we pretty much trap them the same way that we trap the bobcats. We catch them in a cage, we anesthetize them, they're out for about an hour, and then we put that GPS collar on them as well. This is some fun points that we get with these GPS collars. What's great about them is, so we program the collars to get about 8 points, you know, a day. Most of those points are at night, and maybe 1 or 2 are during the daytime hours. And at night, because that's when they're most active, is during the nighttime hours. So dusk to dawn, basically. So this is basically the start of whenever we chose for that 7-day period. And then here are the points of these animals. and where they went. So we can kind of follow where they went. The points though are not live, so we don't know exactly where they are at a particular time or moment. We get these points afterwards. Just some more example of points, and then over the months we get lots of points, hundreds of points, right? And then that's when we make our home range polygon. And so this is an example of the first 12 animals that we had on the air and their home ranges. And you can see that some of them were pretty big home ranges. This guy up here in the Simi Hills had a really large home range. He would go from the Simi Hills up into the Santa Susana area. And he was a young male that was still trying to really establish and figure out his territory. The other thing I wanted to mention is I said that the bobcats had the really smaller home range, well, of the 2.5 to 5 square miles. Well, mountain lions have a home range of 175 square miles, so really big. Those are for the males, and then the females have a bit smaller home range, is about 72 square miles. And then we still are trying to learn more and more about these subadult males, which are those younger males that are trying to establish their territory. Moms kick them out. Now it's time for them to find their own home range. And we're still trying to learn more whether their home ranges are really smaller or are they bigger. It's kind of that as time goes on, we're learning more as we go. Where in the beginning, we thought their home ranges were way bigger, maybe because the males are pushing them around. But sometimes the males end up pushing them into these smaller areas and then they're stuck there. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. Just another example of home ranges though here. Here's our home ranges. And this is empty here now in the Simi Hills for this particular date of 2016, but it's not like that now. Now we have a few more animals there. And I think that sometimes there's various reasons why that fluctuates. Sometimes we have animals on the air and we can't recapture them and their collar dies, or maybe we just don't have the funding or the staff to look for the animals here. Doesn't mean they're not there. You should always assume that mountain lions are in these areas, because if it's habitat they can live in, it's quite the potential that an animal will move into that area. Again, showing that habitat fragmentation and how you can imagine the cutting of the roads and the loss of habitat can really affect the mountain lions. One of the big challenges that we have found with our mountain lions and the research is that they really have a lot of intraspecific conflicts. Now, mountain lions don't like each other. They are solitary animals. They generally live alone, except for when mom is raising the young. And then, you know, after about 1.5 years, she says, okay, you're on your own, go find your spot. So most of the time they are solitary, especially the males. And they feel like any other male is a potential threat. Sometimes even a young female might be a potential threat. We had one adult male kill an adult female. So there's lots of in-species or interspecies fighting among these animals. So having habitat that the young can actually disperse to is really, really important. And as you can imagine, in the Santa Monica Mountains, that's really hard for them because they live on this island. So we find that the young males are really trying to avoid that conflict. And what happens is they get pushed to the edges or the outskirts of the Santa Monica Mountains. You can see that here as well. And this here, all the blue points here, is an adult male that was pretty much running the whole Santa Monica Mountains, and he was pushing these guys off to the sides in the less, the suboptimal habitats, basically, where they're right up against urbanization. And here's just a closer view of P8, a young male that was getting pushed out into these these suboptimal habitats, you know, right along the urbanization edge and even the 405 freeway here. And these, some of these points where he's right against the urban edge here. So what should happen? Well, in reality, if there was enough space and room for these animals to get and find their own habitat, and there were corridors that helped them cross these freeways, they would pretty much do what P16 did. And I'll tell you that what he did here is P16 is the orange points. And then he was a young juvenile that we caught here in the Santa Susanas. And he pretty much was hanging out in kind of a smaller area, but you can see that this is a freeway here. This is the 5 freeway that was kind of hard. He wasn't able to cross it. So we'd kind of come right up along the edge of it and then move around. And then we caught, shortly after we caught P21, who was an adult male. And what he was doing is, it was great to have an adult and a juvenile, you know, that we could see at the same time overlapping. And you could see him constantly following the young lion around. So 21 was following P16 around, and eventually P16 was able to make it over the 126, which is kind of a smaller highway, made it over the 126, started investigating this habitat over here, but here comes P21 following him again and pushing him around. But basically what happens is P21 was, I mean, yes, here I am giving my human story of it, but he didn't stay up there. So P21 ended up coming back down, likely because he needs to protect this habitat here. He needed to protect his home range from any other male lions taking it over. So you can't spend too much time out of your home range, and gave up on chasing P16. And this is a nice example of how this worked. So this was P16's original home range when we first got him. Ended up trekking across the 126, up and over, taking the long route, and then came back down here along Piuma, the Piuma Lake area. And so now his home range is here, and then we had P21 go back over here to his home range. So just a nice example of what could happen, should happen, but it's very hard to do that when you have a 10-lane freeway that's blocking you.
Kathy, we have a question that I think might be a great lead-in to the next part of the presentation. Have you ever found any of these animals east of the 405 freeway?
Yes. Well, so this is a great one. Perfect timing. So I just want to show right here the 405 freeway, right? The Santa Monica Mountains. So we absolutely have found a couple mountain lions. We were all very skeptical at first to think that mountain lions would really be able to handle living this close into the urban areas. And it's so fragmented, especially this section here, kind of where Franklin Canyon is and Bel Air. There's habitat, but there's also a lot of urbanization within. But there's definitely, we've gotten pictures of a mountain lion here. And then P22, the famous P22, our Hollywood cat, actually made it all the way to Griffith Park, which is also pretty great. The thing about P22 though is his home range is super small. You can see this was our first adult male that was on the air, took the whole Santa Monica Mountains. And P22 has a home range of about 8 square miles. So almost that bobcat size home range, super small. So here we go. Let's talk about P22 and the urban interface that he lives with. And here's a nice example. After we were able to catch him, we took his blood and we were able to, and tissue, and we were able to run genetics on him. And we found that he is very closely related to the animals in the Santa Monica Mountains. And so we believe, although we don't know because we didn't catch him until he was in Griffith Park, we believe he came from the Santa Monica Mountains, crossing the 405, and eventually crossing the 101 as well, and then has settled down here in the Griffith Park area. There's that map again to show the size difference of home range. And then these are all a bunch of his points that we have plotted. And what it shows is, even though he is our mountain lion that is completely surrounded by urbanization, he has the most urban landscape within his home range, he still makes really natural choices, which is just hanging out in these green landscaped areas that are natural habitat. Kind of likes going around the reservoir a lot, and then we'll see him sometimes along the park area. So basically this lighter landscape is the manicured lawns like Forest Lawn and the golf course. And you can even see he doesn't spend as much time there. He likes this covered habitat that has the shrubs and the vegetation. So this is a nice example to show that all of our mountain lions, when we look at the percentage amount of time that they spend in these urban landscapes, we found that less than 1% actually spend time within that urban landscape. And they will spend some time in the altered landscape, but over 90% of their time is in the natural landscape, with P22 being slightly different numbers, but not dramatically different, considering how much urbanization is in his habitat or his home range. And he still has 90% of his points are in that natural landscape. So they are doing what they should do and trying to avoid people, but we do know that they have to cross roads somehow to get into these, to disperse, to get away from the adult males. And that in itself leads challenges because they'll try to cross roads, and the same thing happens to them that happens with the bobcats, is they often eventually end up getting hit by cars, either unlucky, maybe they've crossed the road several times, and then finally end up getting hit by a car. But you can imagine along the 405 freeway, they probably don't try to cross too many times because it's such a busy freeway. We believe that it's likely they get hit pretty quick on these guys. But we do have animals that cross Canaan and Las Virgenes. This is Las Virgenes here, this is Canaan. And they might get to cross those roads a little more often. But if it's within your home range and you're constantly crossing, it's a potential that, you're kind of playing Frogger, where eventually maybe you will get hit by a car, maybe you won't, it's hard to say. But here again, we have the 118 freeway, the 101 freeway, we've had animals try to cross over the top, and then some other locations as well. But some animals do make it. There is a great equestrian tunnel here at the Santa Susana Pass that we've actually had some animals cross, and this is P3, one of our early on mountain lions. Caltrans happened to have the camera up there at the time and was monitoring, and so we were able to get these great pictures of him actually crossing underneath and using that tunnel. So some animals are able to find these tunnels and use them. Some animals cross over the top, which puts them at risk. And sometimes just modifying maybe even along the roadways, fencing that will help direct them to these tunnels is a direction that we suggest that that gets used. But we still are currently seeing some animals crossing the 118. Which is great, which is a nice opportunity for young lions to disperse out of the Simi Hills and get up into Los Padres at some point if they can. Again, this is just kind of what the barriers look like for these animals. They come right up to the freeways and then don't always cross because it's not terribly crossable. This is along the Camarillo Grade. This is Liberty Canyon area, kind of this middle section. And then this is Woodland Hills, where we had that one lion that was trying to disperse out and kind of push to the edge there. What we're also seeing with animals, because they're in this, like I said, island in the Santa Monica Mountains, we're finding that there's a lot of inbreeding. Occasionally a mountain lion gets into the mountains, which is great. We had P12 was able to cross from I'll go back, P12 was able to cross from this side of the mountains, the Simi Hills, into the Santa Monica Mountains, which was great. He brought new genetics into our population. But over a period of time, he ended up mating with his daughter. So there's a lot of inbreeding that ends up happening in the mountains. And with inbreeding, at some point, we might start seeing some genetic deformities. Some common ones might be a kinked tail, which is what they saw with the Florida Panthers, but also one that you can't actually physically see is their low sperm count for a lot of males with the inbreeding. And if that's the case, we start seeing low sperm count, then we're not going to be seeing very much reproduction. So we'll start losing the reproduction of these animals. And at some point, maybe these animals will just end up dying off in the Santa Monica Mountains and we won't have them. So we want to make sure that we find ways for these animals, the young to disperse and the new adult males to come into these the Santa Monica Mountains if we want to keep the population going for these animals and keep mountain lions in the Santa Monica Mountains. And biologists have identified some very critical areas to restore for connectivity to the Santa Monica Mountains. I know this is not the best map to look at, but you can see the west side of the mountains, there's some great connectivity potential, but again, they need to get across the 101 freeway. And then right here, more in the central part, which is in Agora Hills and it's the Liberty Canyon area, is also a potential area for restoring connectivity and is where they're actually hoping to build a wildlife bridge at some point. And then if they can get into the Simi Hills, we've already shown that we're seeing crossing along the equestrian tunnel in the Santa Susanas, and then eventually they can lead up to the Los Padres. So Liberty Canyon has been kind of the hotspot of where the talks are to really have these animals cross. It's more of the central of the mountains, which means maybe more animals will find it. And then it's natural habitat on both sides, which is really important. But more important than that, it's publicly owned land as well, not privately owned, so it's not going to get developed on. And I think that that's also really important if you're going to build a bridge that's, you know, $50 billion. So very, very important to make sure that it's going to be successful. This is the bridge that they're hoping to build here. Remember, it has to cross 10 lanes of freeway. So it's a large bridge and it's totally vegetated. So it needs to be able to support all this vegetation. The benefits of it being completely vegetated like this is it provides a lot of cover for the animals to actually cross and to want to cross. Also will be very beneficial to our bobcats, because what we found is even though our bobcats are crossing those smaller roads, they're not really crossing freeways. Freeways, again, the 101 is a barrier for these animals as well, the bobcats, and they'll come right up to it, but they're not generally crossing it in their home ranges, different animals on each side of the freeway, and they're not moving across. Same thing that we're seeing with coyotes is they're not really crossing the 101 freeway as much either from what we've seen in our research. This will benefit smaller species, smaller vertebrates as well, such as lizards. We found there's definitely genetic diversity. There's a lot of different unrelated ant species, and they found that these animals just are not moving across these roads, even some of these smaller roads. So if you have a vegetated landscape, like a bridge, they will. And then you have these small birds that just don't fly that far, like a wren tit or a roadrunner, and a 10-lane freeway is not terribly accessible for them to cross either. Okay, so that's a good.
We have one question about road crossings. When a mountain lion is crossing a road and might be more likely to come into contact with humans, would it deliberately attack a human?
Actually, mountain lions are super shy, and no, that's not what we've seen. What going out and tracking these lions, we go out and not just with the GPS collars, but we'll walk out and on the trails, and we will track the lions. And we have our headgear on and our antenna, and we're listening to the beeps of the signal coming out to us, and literally we'll walk right past the mountain lion and it will stay completely hunkered down in the vegetation. You don't even know you walked past it until, oh, you're using your telemetry gear, and all of a sudden, oh, I hear the beeps are the other direction now. How did I go this way and then this way, and then, oh, you're right there. So they're very, very secretive animals. They do not want to be seen. We had a mountain lion that hunkered down in someone's front yard in their thick bushes during the day because it kind of got caught and stuck there. It was probably moving across from one habitat through the jumping the fences, you know, of the yard, and ended up, maybe the traffic got going, or a gardener or somebody, you know, was out and scared them. And so what the lion did is it just hunkered down. And my coworker was walking past it back and forth. He could see the lion. And the mountain lion just looked at him and said, "You don't see me. I'm not here." Exactly. And so they're so secretive and they don't want to be seen. So it's not likely the case of what would happen.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's get to, we forgot to talk about this. What do mountain lions eat, right? It's really important. So maybe that was a good, you know, introduction into what they actually eat, because mountain lions really want to focus on deer. That's their primary diet. What we found in our study. How do we determine this? So we get all these GPS points that I mentioned, and what happens is we look at the map and we see these clusters here. And a cluster might be, this animal goes back to the same location every night for like 3 or 5 days. And so they'll go to there at night, and then what'll happen is during the daytime, they might come over here to their resting spot. And then the next night they'll go back over and start eating again on their deer. So a deer can last them, you know, depending on how big the deer is, what time of year it is. If it's really hot, it doesn't last as long. But they can last for 4 to 7 days, a deer can. And so that's how we investigate and find out what they're actually eating. Another example of just all the little clusters that we found. And then 88% of their diet is mule deer. And then we have coyotes are also part of their diet, so they'll eat coyotes. And then raccoons as well. We've found badger, skunk. We found all kinds of different types of animals. And then they eat about 3 to 4 deer a month. But one of the things that I think is important for people to understand is, so even though they do live along this urban wildland landscape, primarily they eat natural prey, as I was saying, with 88% their diet being mule deer. But if they're given that opportunity to eat pets or livestock, such as sheep, goats, alpacas, chickens, they might take it. And we've had mountain lions actually eat these types of species. So it's important that we do our part, especially if we live within the mountains and we know mountain lions live there, we live on the edge, is keeping our animals safe. We've even actually had a miniature horse taken by a mountain lion as well. So this is just some of the areas that we've had depredation where mountain lions have actually preyed on some domestic animals, mostly, as I mentioned, sheep, alpaca, and goats. And you can imagine, I mean, if you look at the landscape here, this is natural landscape for them. This is within their home range. And to them, just because an animal is potentially in a corral it's still on 4 legs, it still looks like their prey. So they're still going to go and eat these animals potentially. So that's why it's really important to us, for us to actually do our part in protecting our livestock and our animals. Again, this is just another example of that landscape. To the lions, this is natural landscape. But if you have a pen of goats or sheep here, that's just, it's easy for them to go for. And again, it's even easier for them to hunt goats and sheep that are in a pen than it is for them to try to hunt a deer that can run away. Deer have that opportunity to run into the hills, where your goats and sheep, if they're in a small pen, they are really accessible for a lion. They jump in, they're cornered. Those prey animals are cornered, and so then the lion has kind of a free meal, an easy meal. And so why wouldn't they return as often as they could to these areas if we don't make changes? Some examples of making changes in these landscapes would be taking any kind of shelter that you already have there and then totally enclosing it. So this lady took her goats and she brings them in at nighttime, and she put basically this wiring up to keep a mountain lion from jumping up and over, and the wire goes all the way down to keep them from going through the bars. If you have really large, or you know someone who has really large herds of goats or sheep, then you can use guard dogs to actually protect them. They seem to do a really good job at it as well. Again, their enclosure has to have a roof that can withstand the weight of a mountain lion, because they're curious, they're going to want to try to get in, and so they might jump on top of it as well. These guys can jump 10 feet with no problem. So it's really important to make sure it's a full, good structure enclosure. And it's really important to make sure you bring them in every night. Even if you haven't seen a mountain lion in your area in, 5 weeks, a month, 5 months, bringing those animals in every night is extremely important, because just because you don't see a lion doesn't mean the lion's not there. I guess I'm just going to go ahead and go on, or do you have questions?
I have a couple questions,
Okay.
if now's a good time. So a question about the mountain lion's solitary nature. Is it because of the limited space they have, or why is that?
That's just that's their behavior. That is, cats, like I mentioned, cats really, they're not terribly social animals. So mountain lions have their solitary behavior. Bobcats, same thing, solitary behavior. A lot different than your African lions, right, that are in prides. But here it's just their solitary. And maybe it's because I think in Africa, right, the lions actually help each other hunt, right? Here they just don't need that. Maybe it's because they have the thicker vegetation or bush that they can successfully hunt on their own. But yeah, they're very solitary and very territorial.
And then Millie says that she spotted a large number of deer last week grazing on the golf course at Griffith Park. Is it likely that mountain lions, I guess P22, would detect these deer, and how?
So I really think they can smell pretty good, right? Because when they're marking their territories, they'll scrape and they'll defecate, and sometimes they even spray. So they can smell, and they smell each other, and I'm sure they smell their prey. And just, it's always a good rule of thumb that if there are deer, there's probably mountain lions because that's their primary food source, right? So they're going to follow those deer around wherever they can. So yeah, he'll absolutely find them. Whether he attacks them on the golf course because there's not as much cover to ambush is more questionable, because he might be seen before he can actually get to them. but it's quite possible we've also had them, you know, killed in more of an open golf course area too. So it really just depends. But most of the time when we find the deer that have died or that have been killed and eaten, it's kind of in a bushy area, but they'll maybe drag them back into the bush to keep it hidden from other scavengers, especially coyotes. So it's, you know, it's kind of that opportunity. Where's the opportunity? And if they happen to be there. That's part of why mountain lions probably are moving. They're constantly moving. Every night they're moving. Their home range is pretty big. So they're always looking for their food source and protecting their habitat.
Awesome. Thank you. Great questions, everyone. Keep them coming.
Yeah. Okay. So I just want to talk about this. This is a really important thing, is the rodent poisons and how it affects our wildlife. When I think they first started doing this project in 1996, which is actually before I came on, and even in 2002, when we started to see rat poison, these animals dying, what are they dying from? And rat poisons was something we were finding actually in the systems of these animals. We were finding it in their livers when we do a necropsy, which is basically an autopsy that you do for animals when they die. As I mentioned, we were finding a lot of bobcats that had mange, and then also that not only did they have mange, but they had rat poisons in their system. So this is not something we had expected to see. It's not something we were looking for, but it's one of the things that's really valuable about having research projects and collaring these animals. If we didn't collar the animals, we might not have ever learned about this because you don't know where the bodies are when animals die if they don't have a collar on them, unless they died right out in front of you. And that's rarely the case. Sometimes, a lot of times they go and they die underneath a bush and when they're feeling sick like that. So what we were able to determine through our research over the years is 90% of the bobcats in our study tested positive for rat poisons. And then 95% of the mountain lions in our study tested positive for rat poisons. We found it in 83% of coyotes. We found gray fox, although we weren't studying gray fox too much, but we had collared a couple of them. So some of our gray fox died as well. We found one of our raccoons that we had collared also died. And this raccoon looked like it didn't get it from secondary, but maybe it got it from direct poisoning from eating out of a bait box. So we're seeing it in a lot of different species and almost everything that we've been studying. So these are anticoagulant rodenticide poisons. They're basically poisons that prevent your blood from clotting. And we found all these different compounds of what we tested for, and we found it in several different species of animals. And the different species die different ways, particularly coyotes, they tend to just bleed out. And then bobcats, you know, it weakens their immune system and it makes it harder for them to actually fight diseases that they have. We have had several mountain lions die directly from it. It's just an example of plotting some of the compounds, like how many compounds some of our bobcats have actually been exposed to, and you can see that most of them have been exposed to 2 or more different types of rat poisons in their system. So that means they're getting it from a couple of different places from their prey, potentially. And we've had several mountain lions die. P3 and P4, the ones that were up here in the Simi Hills, were the first 2 mountain lions that died from rat poisons. And then we had this guy, was a female. She was a young female trying to figure out her home range. She ended up this great picture of her in someone's backyard. And then she was moved back to the natural space. And then 9 months later, she died from 5 different compounds of rat poisons in her system. This is another mountain lion, had 6 different poisons in his system when he died. And we'd been following this guy since he was a baby, young. And this particular lion had 5 different compounds of rat poisons. Just this last September, we found him dead. So it's still ongoing. It hasn't stopped, and it's been going on since at least 2002, probably even before that, but we really noticed it back in 2002. And then how does this happen, I think, is kind of one of the questions everyone wants to know, right? Is you see these bait boxes, and I think a lot of folks assume that the rats go in the box and they die in the box, but it's not actually the case. The way this poison is designed is for the rats to go in, they eat it, they come back out, so they don't feel any effects. And it takes several days before they actually feel effects. That way, they don't realize that what they're eating is actually making them sick. Because if they knew that and they started feeling bad, they would avoid going back in and eating. And so they go in, they eat, they come back out, they go back in. Takes almost 10 days before they die. During that time, they start to get really weak, they get disoriented. We've seen rats doing circles and flips. Well, and then this draws a lot of attention by the predators, and they are easy prey. So now they're easy to catch as well. And so you see them in all these different types of vessels of how it can be put out. This one really bothers me a lot as well because the poisons aren't even contained in the container. They're actually spilling out of the container, and that's what all of this blue pellet is. So now people's pets are potentially exposed as well because your dog could come right up to this and lick it and now be exposed to this rat poisons. These are so common. All of these poisons are extremely common. They're used by golf courses, local businesses, restaurants. Your HOA might use it. If you hire a pesticide company, they're going to use it as well. And how does it happen? It doesn't happen because the mountain lion directly eats the poison. What happens is the mountain lion's eating the prey that actually ate the poison. So it's moving up that food chain. So a mountain lion might get to eat, a prey animal here, but potentially what's happening with the mountain lions is it's tertiary, which is 3 levels up. And it's actually because the lion eats maybe the coyote, the raccoon that we were talking about, maybe a fox that ate a rat that ate the poison. We see this with the bobcats, as I mentioned, but also raptors are exposed to this as well. And right now is nesting season. We have all the raptors out and the owls. I've found like 4 or 5 barn owl nests already that I've been watching, but we don't know exactly how many raptors are being exposed because it's not a primary study for us right now due to funding, but we know that they are exposed and they also are dying from rodenticide poisons. And as I mentioned, your pets also. So some alternatives that we can do instead of using poisons is, well, first of all, making sure that the cities crack down on some of this trash, especially businesses also. This is you putting rat boxes up, 10 rat boxes up because you have a lot of rats because you have a lot of food for them is really not the solution. It doesn't fix anything. It just continues to breed more rodents. Getting our HOAs to make changes, I think, is really, really important as well. And then making changes at home. And there's some simple things that we can do. So any holes that you have, this is an example of holes that instead of actually closing up these holes and preventing rats from getting into the building, they just quickly, lazily put out a rat box, which again, doesn't really solve your problem. So going back to the old-fashioned traps, maybe snap traps, electric traps, things like that, are all better ways to control rodents, especially rodents that are in your house. And then preventing access in general is super important. So sealing up all these deferred maintenance things in your home, and this is probably a great time to do that, right? We're all home. Let's seal up and at least audit your house and see where these potential areas that animals, rodents could be getting in, and take action ahead of time before you actually have an infestation or a problem. And especially pay attention to like all these pipes here with the small holes and cables where cable guys come in and they drill the holes, but they don't seal and caulk the holes up, preventing the rodents from getting in. So some great examples of that, and underneath your doors. We suggest using like 1/4-inch wire if it's mice and rats that you're trying to keep out, because a mouse can get into the size of a dime. So you want to make sure that the wiring is small enough. Copper wiring as well, stuffing the holes with copper, and then you can seal over the top of that. And then any of your roof vents also are super important because they can jump up into those and get into your attics. And then, so you're sealing up, closing up, trapping, but access to what helps them breed. So the things that help them breed are food and shelter, right? So you want to remove any food access that you have. A lot of us love birds, but those bird feeders are huge attractants for rats, mice, and even ground squirrels, right? They want to eat the seed from there, and the birds are super messy and they dump that stuff all over the ground. So you want to make sure, if you have to have a bird feeder, put it over a hard surface, put it out just in the morning, and then clean it up every day. So take some actions so you can still have your birds come, but make sure that you clean up that mess. If not, you're just breeding more rodents. Cleaning up all your fruit, and access to fruit. And then for some of the fruit trees, it's really simple to put this, you want to do it about 2 feet of steel metal wrap there. It's kind of like a metal flashing, wrapping it around the tree. You can see a lot of cities do that for palm trees, and that's to keep the rodents from climbing up and down the palm trees and nesting in there. So the palm trees are great because they can nest in it, and they have food access to it. And then they'll come down and get more food from you. And compost bins. I think we forget, we love compost bins because everyone says, oh, you should compost, which is great. But compost bins also are a great way to feed rodents. And so you want to make sure you use closed compost bins to keep them out, so they're not getting free food. And then removing thick vegetations. One of the biggest things I would highly recommend is removing ivy, because ivy is a huge attractant and a great cover for rodents. And then you don't even realize you have a rodent problem until it's really bad. And then also removing, if you want to prevent and slow access into the house, is removing vegetation right up against the house line, because again, that's a nice place for them to hide. And then find little access holes into your house, and especially preventing any vining plants that might grow up your house walls or pipes. You want to get rid of those. So just some examples. And this is just another great example. Marin County actually made this, their vector control, and I thought it was really great, so I wanted to share it. But it's a real simple infographic on things that you can do and things to check and audit, clean up the trash and compost bins, making sure your fruit is picked up. They even suggest picking up pet droppings, because they might go and eat the corn, because a lot of our, pet food is corn based, so they might actually eat the corn out of it. And then all the little vents in the crawl spaces and attics and pipes, and then debris piles. You want to make sure you get rid of debris piles that are easy places for them to hide and to nest in as well. So just some more examples of that stuff. I think that, let's see, I think that that's probably a good spot to end. Yeah, because then we can answer questions. If you guys have more questions, so you can go to NPS Nature Neighbor. So that's our National Park Service for the Santa Monica Mountains website about Nature Neighbor. Or you can email me, natureneighbor.nps.gov. That generally comes to me and I can answer more questions for you if you need it.
Great. We have a few minutes left for any questions, so go ahead and fire away. We have one question up right now. Do you know, Kathy, if there are any like coordinated citywide efforts to limit the use of rodent poison?
So there have been some cities that have chosen to sign resolutions to not use poisons. So cities like Simi Valley, Agora Hills, I'm trying to think that there's several of them, Ojai, Malibu, all of those have chosen not to use poisons on city property, but they cannot control what homeowners do at this stage. And that comes from the state. So it's getting the state to be able to allow cities to make that determination that you can't use rat poisons in the city. And it's not at that level. I think they're trying to pass something for that. But it's not at that level where it's passed yet. So they can't control it, right? Let's put it that way. They can't control it right now. And so part of what we try to do with these programs is actually just inform people in general, that provide that education, and hope that after I inform you guys, maybe you'll inform 10 more people, and it just kind of moves on. There have been a couple organizations that have started. There's Poison Free Malibu, Poison Free Agora. So there's actually been some homeowners that live within those cities that have actually even set up their own nonprofits to further educate the community and get the community to kind of stop on their own. It's a slow process. I mean, we've been working on this for years, but we keep chugging along, and the more people that know, the further we're going to get with this and get people to use alternatives instead of rat poisons.
Thank you. Feel free to fire away any other questions. I actually have a quick one. P stands for Puma, right?
Correct.
And so what is the difference in the nomenclature, like Puma and mountain lion?
So mountain lion is just kind of that common name, right? Puma is part of their scientific name.
Okay.
But the mountain lions have been called cougars. I mean, there's so many different names for them that people have used over the years. So we say mountain lion because it's common for everyone to know. If I were to say Puma, they'd be like, what? So we just kind of start with that scientific name. And to do ML for each number is kind of a pain, right?
Yeah.
You notice with bobcats, we just did B, right?
Thanks. And then one question coming in from VNA for you, Kathy. What is your favorite part of your job?
Oh, wow. Well, I'm not in the field as much as I used to be, which I really liked being in the field a lot. But right now what I do a lot of is that education and community outreach, which I think is so important. One of the, when I first kind of started, all that great scientific information we were gathering was being disseminated at conferences for peers and other scientists, and through some of the scientific literature, but it wasn't necessarily getting disseminated out to the general public. And I feel like the public and the homeowners, the people who live nearby, are the ones that are actually going to help and benefit and should know about the research that occurs so that they can make decisions and help support the parks and help support the wildlife and understand that everything we do impacts the wildlife around us and the natural spaces around us, from planting invasive plants, you know, putting out poisons, dumping our goldfish in a creek because we don't want them anymore. All of these things affect the natural landscape, the habitat. So I think it's really important that we get this information out to the general public. So that's part of probably what I really enjoy doing now, is getting a chance to get out there. And what I really love is when organizations like Poison Free Malibu, Poison Free Agora start joining in, and all of you guys that would join in and help get that information out and spread it more.
Thank you. And then Millie asks, is there a way to get involved with NPS research without, or support it without being a researcher?
Wow. I guess there's always support, right? Any support that you can do. There's, trying to think, sometimes we do volunteer events, more for restoration work. And then we also, which we don't have any right now, but we were doing scat projects. So there's a whole nother presentation on coyotes that could be done, that we actually had citizen science come and help us dissect poop. So I don't know if that's something that you'd be interested in doing. I mean, we're not doing poop, that particular project anymore, but I'm working on trying to get raptor polls up and learn more about hawks and owls, and what they would eat in a, kind of that urban or suburban landscape. And we might be starting something on owl pellets as well. So kind of stay tuned for that. I mean, everything's a little bit on hold right now because we're trying to figure out when we'd even be able to have groups together again. But any support, you know, even if it's just positive reinforcement, great job, you know, getting the message out that I'm trying to give you today, spread that, talk to your HOAs, talk to your community members about this, I think is a great way to support us also.
Awesome. Well, with that, I think right on the dot, we will wrap it up. So I want to give a huge thanks to Kathy for the presentation today, and to all of you for coming. Thanks so much and have a great one.
Thank you guys. Bye.